Glad to know you're still with us. An investment banking firm in Nigeria has cautioned against further interest rate hike by the Central Bank of Nigeria, CBN, saying such move is not good for the economy. The firm further predicted that the Naira might stabilize around the 1,500 Naira per dollar region for the next month, attributing this to increased participation in the NAFEM window, suggesting that liberalisation policies could keep the Naira within the 1,500 Naira per dollar mark to the 1,600 Naira per dollar range for the next 6 months, barring unforeseen circumstances. Well, joining me for this is the Head of Research, Commercial Partners, Dr. Ifeanyi Oba. Dr. Ifeanyi, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Well, some analysts, including yourself, have cautioned against further interest rate hikes by the CBN, saying such a move is not good for the economy. Could you expatiate on this?
Okay. I think the bone of contention would be the correlation between interest rates and inflation. So what we have seen by looking at the data is that when you run a correlation analysis between interest rates and inflation, you see a positive relationship. That means anytime you increase interest rates, we have a follow-up increase in inflation, while we are expecting a negative relationship as regards to a prior expectation. But Nigeria's situation is different, and the structural relationship of how goods and services work around the economic landscapes gives us that nuanced perspective in Nigeria. So having an upfront solution of just increasing interest rates without accounting for these factors might not be the way to go. However, there's also some benefits from increasing interest rates, which could also be seen as giving confidence or stability to the currency, which we desperately need at this time. But I guess the bone of contention would be the CBN digesting these numbers and coming out with the best solution in order to give Nigeria the best foot forward.
All right, I like what you've said, trying to see the correlation, between interest rates and, of course, inflation rate. But we see that this same monetary tool is, effective in some of the climes. And then you talked about something. You said there are other factors, maybe some structural factors and all of that. So beyond using this particular monetary tool, what other factors or what other monetary policy tools do you think the CBN can actually use to address inflation in Nigeria if you feel that, the hike in monetary policy rate isn't really doing much?
Okay, so the interest rate already in Nigeria is already high, and what we can use to tackle the inflation problem would be a mixture between fiscal policy and monetary policy. Like when we drill down to the root cause of inflation, we can see that food inflation is the primary driver of our accelerating inflation. And by the time we check the dynamics of this food inflation, we can see that food at farm gate remains stable, while food at a marketplace is what is elevated. So looking at how we can try and reduce these elevated prices at the marketplace will go a long way in solving the inflationary pressures. Also, we have insecurities happening with the farmers and the high transportation costs. All these are not things that the CBN alone can handle. But what the CBN has chosen to do is to strengthen the transmission mechanism. What do I mean by that? So the reason why the interest rate is not actually having the desired effect on the economy is because, like you rightly said, Nigeria's structure is different. And the structure of Nigeria is not credit driven. That means the person that is starting this business might not necessarily go to the bank or find other sources in order to get funds rather than going to the bank directly. That's why we don't see an interest rate hike affecting the economy instantly. What the CBN has tried to do is try to make sure the transmission mechanism is more effective, make sure the banks are giving more loans and participating more in the economy and shoring up that base as they have a goal of reaching $1 trillion economy in terms of GDP.
All right, well, let's look at this again. Still talking about Nigeria's inflation. I like how that you've addressed insecurity and food inflation, which, of course, we see the impact. But looking at the foreign exchange volatility that Nigeria currently has, it has significant pass-through to Nigeria's inflation, among other factors which have also mentioned. So this tells us that addressing the foreign exchange crisis will significantly impact inflationary pressure. So first, do you think the Apex Bank is doing enough to address this particular issue, which has significant pass-through? And then what do you make of the recent policies of the CBN CBN, whether it is the cash pool or the price control, the PTA, BTA, or even the IMTO, and, all of those other measures?
I think this is a situation of it's going to get worse before it gets better because where the apex banks had come from were coming from a situation where there was lack of transparency and the policy used by the then CBN governor was that of a controlled policy, while the policy that this CBN governor is happening to use is a laissez-faire policy. And he has been doing that in order to liberate our market. And this is also going by the recommendation of the World Bank and other international committees. So liberalizing the market and allowing the forces of demand and supply determine what happens in the market has some cost. And the cost is what we are bearing by having the Naira fall to the region it's falling as at now. But immediately we can give the confidence we can to the foreign investors. We will see certain level of stability. We can show up our reserves and gain confidence. That's why looking at ways to stabilize the exchange rate is very paramount. But everything the CBN can do can only be short or medium term because the foundation of exchange rate is just a measure of exports versus imports. And until we're able to shore up our exports in order for it to, make the imports not outweigh the exports, we would still be having a situation of our exchange rate falling to in regions that we don't like. So even though the CBN can have a near or medium term fix, we still need a long term solution that is rooted in increasing our exportation, reducing our imports and demand, especially for food and agricultural services that we can produce ourselves. We are not going to come out of the exchange rate high. And remember, this is not just something that is peculiar to Nigeria. SSA countries, in fact, African countries all around the world have been facing problems with the dollar and struggling with the dollar. That's why conversations around looking for an alternative currency for international exchange like the BRICS currency has been gaining mainstream audience.
Well, looking at some of the things you've talked about, some of them sort of fall within the fiscal, authority. So what do you think? Do you think that authority has actually been doing enough to address these issues that you have outlined?
So they can certainly be doing better. What we actually need in Nigeria is a synergy between our fiscal and monetary authorities because we cannot have the fiscal authority pushing a policy that negates the monetary authority. We are going to have a counteractive result in and who is going to bear the brunt of it is the everyday Nigerian. There's a popular saying by Karl Marx, like if a doctor or a lawyer makes a mistake, it leads to a casualty of one. But if an economics or a political scientist makes a mistake, it leads to a casualty of multitude of people, hence the enormous hardship. So even if they have done a little, more needs to be done.
All right, so let me ask you this particular one now. Do you fear that the exchange rate may spiral out of control, as some are already saying, and some persons are saying maybe in the next few days we might begin to see the Naira, exchange at 2,000 against the greenback? Are you concerned about that and the implication that could have on the Nigerian populace?
So my concern about the exchange rate is not necessarily the rate at which it falls. My concern is the stability. So whether the exchange rate is at 2,000, 1,000, 1,500, it's not really the main bone of contention when it comes to, bringing in FDIs
But this is a two-way
FPIs.
street. Let me come in here. This is a two-way street. There is the part where we want investors to come. We want them to see some level of stability so they can come in. But then we also have the populace, the people who are suffering, the people who can no longer afford the things they could afford before now. Shouldn't you be looking at all of these things before making decisions?
Yes, you're very correct. Like the economy is facing lots of hardship right now, but it's only going to get better after it gets worse. It's like the pill that you're going to feel sick a little while, but after you feel sick, you're going to get better. Because from where we are coming from a place of darkness, and for us to move into gradual light, it would require people tightening a little bit of their buckles and bracing themselves for economic hardship. But in the long run, if the policies and measures are followed and have outlined for the progress of Nigeria, I feel in the long run, we're going to see an uptick in the value of our currency, an uptick in the GDP of the country.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Ifeanyi, Head of Research, Commercial Partners. It's been a pleasure listening to you today.
Thank you very much.